in the next 2 to 3 minutes so that we can get to this amazing panel. All right, as people trickle in, I'm just going to start with some welcomes and introductions. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very exciting event, Lessons from the Movement to Overturn Ireland's Abortion Ban. I'm Emily Maestrelis. I'm a Senior Program Officer in the Global Health Justice and Governance Program at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. And I would just like to do some brief announcements about the panel and introduce our panelists and then our moderator. So this is actually an event that is part of a series that is co-hosted by the Global Health Justice and Governance Program, as well as the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. This series has been called Innovations for Advancing Women's Rights, Beijing +25 and Beyond. And this was a series that began in the fall of 2020 with a look back at the now historic 1995 Beijing Conference and Declaration. And since then, we've explored innovations in women's rights advocacy, the role of arts in documenting and driving social change, and intergenerational movements. And today's event is our last of the series, which we're sad about, but this is a wonderful culmination at that. And if you did happen to miss our past events, you can find the recordings on the Human Rights Institute or Global Health Justice and Governance YouTube pages, which we'll provide the link to in the chat. Before moving into introducing our panel, we want to thank our student co-sponsors on this event, RightsLink, Columbia Society of International Law, and SPIN at the law school. And we'd also like to acknowledge that Columbia's graduate student workers are currently on strike. The graduate workers of Columbia UAW Union have been bargaining with the university for about 2 years now and have yet to secure a contract that improves working conditions, including adequate healthcare and protections from discrimination and harassment. And the topic of our event today, of course, draws parallels to the graduate student workers' demands. The right to healthcare in particular, the right to reproductive healthcare has always been an economic issue. And Global Health Justice and Governance and the Human Rights Institute are consulting with students, the student group co-sponsors for today's events and other collaborators to potentially change our approach to holding events during the strike to stand in solidarity with the grad workers. Today, we'll be recording today's event for anyone who cannot participate due to the strike, and we'll put the link to the union's hardship fund in the chat so that you can learn a little bit more and support the student workers if you wish to. Now I'm going to move on to our panel. I am very excited to introduce the panelists and moderator of today's discussion, and I'm going to keep it brief so that we can get to that discussion. So we're going to drop fuller bios for each panelist and our moderator into the chat so you can learn more. On our panel, we have Aideen Kane, one of the directors and producers of the documentary The Eighth, which many of you have seen in the last week. Thank you for participating in that screening in tandem to this event. Aideen is also the Vice President of Production at Fork Films, a documentary company based in New York. And she's currently producing a new feature documentary on income inequality, which is co-directed by Abigail Disney and Kathleen Hughes. Welcome, Aideen. Ailbhe Smyth is a feminist, LGBTIQ, and socialist activist. Most recently, Ailbhe played a leading role in the victorious marriage equality referendum in Ireland and was co-director of the For Yes national campaign, which run the right to abortion for women in Ireland. Ailbhe's work is featured in The Eighth, as you all must remember. Welcome, Ailbhe. Andrea Horan has worked in strategic communications for 15 years before launching her own impressive and many ventures, including Tropical Popical Nail Bar, I love saying that, the Hunreal Issues, which is a feminist political portal, And she's also co-presenter of 2 podcasts with Irish Times journalist Una Mullally, the first of which is called Don't Stop Repealin', which was a source of information, advocacy, and positive support during the weeks leading up to the vote to repeal the 8th Amendment. Andrea's activism is also featured in the documentary, so you must recognize her as well. Welcome, Andrea. And Leah Hoctor is the Senior Regional Director for Europe at the Center for Reproductive Rights. She's Irish and now lives in Geneva, where the center's regional office for Europe is based. She has a legal background, but much of her work now sits at the intersection of legal advocacy and political strategies. Welcome, Leah. And last, but certainly not least, I'm very pleased to welcome our moderator today, Dr. Wendy Chavkin, who's a professor emerita in the population and family health and obstetrics and gynecology at Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. Dr. Chavkin is co-founder for Global Doctors for Choice, a transnational network of physicians who advocate for access to comprehensive reproductive health care, including safe abortion. She's also worked with Irish Doctors for Choice for many years. And throughout her academic career, Dr. Chavkin has used research as a tool for advocacy on behalf of public policies that expand access to reproductive health and rights. So before turning the mic over to Dr. Chavkin, I would just like to encourage everyone in the audience to submit your questions throughout this hour. You can do so through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be selecting a few questions to ask our panelists at the end of the hour, so please don't be shy and contribute as much as you would like to. With that, I will move this along to Wendy, and I'm looking forward to this rich discussion. Thanks all.
Thanks, Emily. Hello, everybody. Because I have been involved with Irish Doctors for Choice for some years, I was actually lucky enough to be in Ireland at the time of the referendum. And Ailbhe and I were just reminiscing that we had last seen each other at the glorious celebration at Coalition headquarters. So let me start off with you, Ailbhe. You are a seasoned organizer. You've been at it on this issue for many a year, including many a year where things weren't looking so good. What was it about this moment that got you and some of the other organizers to recognize that this was an opportunity that was different?
Well, that's, of course, a really key question. And you're quite right. I mean, we were at this for a very, very long time. Indeed, our first referendum, which actually prohibited abortion constitutionally, was back in 1983. And we had another 2 sets of referendums after that, more or less at 10-year intervals. So, you know, by the 2000s, we'd had a referendum in 2002, and I think people felt very flat. We weren't asked the question, did we want to remove this prohibition? We were just asked some kind of question that we'd already answered before. And then very interestingly, when the crash happened, and it happened in Ireland just as much as it happened everywhere else, we began as feminists to put our heads above the parapets again and to say, this is not good. We can't be having this kind of situation. So we set up a couple of organizations, Feminist Open Forum, Irish Feminist Network, and actually abortion, it transpired, was really the hot issue in those groups around about 2008, 2009. And then a very important case happened, which I know Leah Hoctor will talk about, I'm sure. So there were the ABC cases in the European Court of Human Rights, which ultimately led to pressure being put on our government to clarify the situation in relation to abortion, at least to save a woman's life. But then we were building up momentum ourselves on the issue. And in 2012, then an extremely tragic event happened, which many people will know about. Savita Halpanavar, a young Indian woman who'd come with her husband to work in Ireland. It was their first very much wanted baby. And as a result of being refused a termination in an Irish hospital, she died. at 16 weeks of pregnancy. And there was an absolute immediate cry of outrage went up around the country. People were disgusted, they were angry. I think also we were very ashamed that this could happen to a young woman. And it was, this outrage was very much, you could feel the mood had shifted. People were saying, enough is enough, we've had enough of this. And there was, you know, huge swells of people out on the streets in Dublin and also in other smaller cities. So, you know, that moment of emotion, you just know when you feel that emotion, this terrible event, and you're feeling if anything good can come of this, we can start something that's really going to shift this. And we had said never again. So that was really when that sense of this is the moment that we need to grasp, because the issue is fully on the agenda. The emotion is there. The anger is there. It's more than feminists. It's more than pro-choice activists. It's everybody. And I certainly myself and a couple of friends, I was very conscious that what was happening was a shift in the way people were thinking about abortion and reacting to it. People were ashamed that a woman couldn't have got an abortion. So that was the first. And that we had an opportunity to really take the initiative. And it was the first time that we could go out there proactively. All of the referendums that we've had, we were on the back foot. We were having to jump to the opposition's tune. This time we could say, we want change. We want to remove this cruel and killing prohibition in our constitution. And from that moment on, and very much helped and assisted by the European Court of Human Rights judgment, we began to think strategically as to how that moment of taking the initiative, in what direction we were going to put it. So we were very clear. We needed a clear objective. We'd got to get rid of the obstacle. That was our objective, repeal the 8th Amendment. We knew that we needed to be more than feminists and pro-choice activists, so it had to be cohesive. It had to involve and engage many people. We needed a good time frame. So I can remember going around in 2012 and 2013 saying it's going to take us 5 years. I had no idea how long it would take, but it really sounded good, 5 years. But my point about that is that, and we did as it happened, but my point there is that we put quite specific things in place without necessarily knowing how they'd work out. And they didn't all work out very well, but it was that thing of we're going to take charge here. We've had enough of being told that we cannot take control of our own bodies. So we want to take political control here. And that, of course, didn't just happen overnight. That was 5 years of extremely hard work.
So let me follow up one of the many, many points you've made and turn to Leah for that. Since you handled those human rights cases that Ailbhe just referred to, how do you, from your outside, I mean, your inside-outside position, because you're Irish, but you don't live in Ireland at this point, and you've been involved in these Irish cases, but with another hat on. How do you understand the relationship between those cases and this subsequent mobilization?
So I think there were basically 3 cases that were, I think, relevant. So one is the first that Ailbhe mentioned, and that was a case that came before Savita Halappanavar died, but the judgment in the case was issued by the European Court of Human Rights around, I think, just before she died. And so the 2 things came together and culminated ultimately in the government legislating for the only exception that existed in Irish law at the time, which was where a woman's life was at risk, abortion could be performed. And so there was legislation introduced then to deal with that exception. I think then, as Ailbhe spoke about, the movement was underway, and there were 2 other cases, which are the cases that I was really involved in and the Centre for Reproductive Rights was really involved in. And those are the cases of 2 women called Siobhan Whelan and Amanda Mellett, who filed their cases with the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, which was a much less well-known body in Ireland at the time. Everyone knew about the European Court of Human Rights, and very few people in the public domain would have known about this Human Rights Committee. And the women filed their cases around 2014. And they were women who had been denied access to abortion care in Ireland and had travelled to another country to end their pregnancies. And they had received diagnoses of fatal fetal impairment in the course of their pregnancies. And they had endured great suffering as a result of having to travel, as many women in Ireland did. And the committee in 2016 and 2017 issued its decisions and found violations of their human rights under international treaties, including of their right to freedom from ill treatment. So a violation by Ireland of the ban on torture and cruel and inhuman treatment. So a very grave finding. And I think, you know, as Ailbhe said, the movement was really underway at the time to generate and hold the kind of public demand for change and to grow political will to act. And I think it was really important both women were part of that movement, and in the deciding that the decisions that they made to file those cases and take their cases to the Human Rights Committee, it was really an act of them of not just looking for justice for their own suffering, but very much an action to contribute to this movement for change. And I think for us in our support to them in terms of the process with the Human Rights Committee, it was really critical that those cases were very much part of that advocacy strategy and that political and legal and policy process that Ailbhe and others were driving at the national level. And so, you know, when the cases were filed, but also when the decisions came out and in advance of them, we had many, many months of hard work with Ailbhe, with the National Women's Council, with the Irish Family Planning Association, with many organisations in Ireland that were very active at the time, to make sure that the cases supported and that the findings of the committee very much supported the demands on the ground for legal and policy change. And that was very important to both women and was very important to us. And I think it's one of the learnings is how you can leverage international accountability. And Ireland as a government and as a state, you know, is takes seriously its standing on the international arena. It takes seriously to some degree its role in the international community. So we always believed that it would not be dismissive of these decisions. And so the goal was really to ensure that the findings of the committee and the orders that the committee made to Ireland in terms of the remedies of, you know, to both women, but also ultimately the remedy of law reform and the overturn of the ban on abortion, was really critical that these findings could be leveraged by the activists in Ireland who were leading this drive for change, and that our role was to be supportive of them and to kind of work with them around creating this demand on foot of the committee cases. So it was very important for us, for example, that it wasn't just the Centre for Reproductive Rights who were saying Ireland has to comply with these decisions. It was also very important that, I mean, remember we had the first kind of, when the first decision came out, we had a joint platform where we were all together with Ailbhe and other leaders of the National Advocacy Campaign. We were all calling for implementation of the decisions and the government's compliance with the decisions. And I think in a way, the timing of those cases being filed, you know, those women who filed them, as I said, were very part of that national movement. So the timing was no coincidence. And I think also then the timing of the committee decisions coming out in 2016, 2017, then very much supported the work that was going on domestically in that law reform process. And I think that's the learning that I would draw from this, is that when you are if you're seeking to use international accountability strategies as to buffer and to support a national strategy for change, it's really important that you do that work. If you are outside of Ireland, if you're an international organization, it's really important that you do that work together with the national civil society that is driving that demand for change. Right. And it's very important that what you're seeking is something that they endorse and that that bolsters the national advocacy demands. And I think in these instances that was the case, and that paid off, I think.
And I have had a somewhat parallel experience with you, which is that focused on the doctors, because Irish Doctors for Choice, or Doctors for Choice Ireland, as they would refer to themselves, were the active participants in the country, and Global Doctors for Choice was in a position of providing them with whatever resources they requested. And so those included lots of technical materials, all the way through, both in the advocacy phase and then in implementation, as well as whatever we've picked up about how to help doctors learn to be advocates. So it was that similar thing. I just want to flag for our discussion with the audience later that many countries in the world care about international bodies and the United Nations. That's a poser for those of us in the United States, because we don't. So when we come to thinking about strategies here, we have a slightly different and in that regard, a tougher road. Yeah. So Andrea, you've obviously had lots of relevant experience, but we're not a long-termer in this specific fight in the same way that these other folks have been. So one of the things you could help us learn is, how did you go about attracting new and different people to participate in this movement?
Yeah, I was definitely jumping on the coattails of the campaign for sure, and was lucky enough to engage with Ailbhe from the very outset, and was able to kind of get the strategy and the thought process directly. Mm-hmm. But I own an ale bar in Dublin, and we have loads of girls working there and people coming in and out, and we had a general election. And the girls didn't care about politics. Our WhatsApp group was made up of glitter and polish and all that kind of jazz. And the minute that the politicians came in to get their nails done, the girls had this exposure, and suddenly their interest was flared. And I was like, this is really interesting, because this tiny bit of exposure has really mobilized these women. And they were like, our WhatsApp group changed to like, how's the recounts going? What's going on? And I was like, this is phenomenal, because you've basically gone to their space. So as someone who's worked in PR and consumer brands for so long, like audience and targeting was very important to me. And I was like, I don't engage in campaigning or activism in the traditional sense. I say traditional, it's changed so much, but I am not academic. I don't kind of engage in angry ways of communicating. I'm all about like a gorge, colorful, fun way of activating. So I kind of put together a PR plan in that sense, and thought about who the audience was, who was like me, who wanted to get involved, didn't maybe know they wanted to get involved, but where their spaces were. It was in the space of celebrity, it was on social media, it was in like art, it was in, we wanted to get men on board, so it was about getting male artists involved, and kind of tapping into all their networks, and remembering that not like with social media or whatever, when people came to our platform, they were already engaged, and we were trying to get onto other people's platforms. So we were really trying to tap into communities and make those communities feel empowered to want to talk about abortion, because when we started this, we would approach a lot of people and they'd be like, oh God, no, I'm not comfortable putting that on my social media. So we were trying to make it softer, easier, and more colorful and fun, and make it something that people wanted to talk about. Obviously, the human rights side of it is there, but for a lot of people, that's not enough. And you have to kind of come into different ways of making it. So it may not be academic, but it's like something that they want to share, something that feels like like encouraging a community of people that if they see someone sharing it, somebody else will share it and somebody else will get engaged. So it was all very fun, lighthearted, and we said throwing glitter on an issue without minimizing it was kind of our line. So yeah, that's how we went about it.
I had a mother who threw glitter on everything she could. If she dropped a stain on the rug, she put glitter on it. So
oh my God, I would love her.
On that note, and since you brought up art, let's turn to the artist. And Aideen, what led you to zoom in and decide to make the 8th? And also, we're all really curious as to what it was like to be doing a documentary when the end was unknown. This was in real time. So could you speak about both of those angles?
Sure, thanks, Wendy. So the 3 of us made this film. And obviously back to timing, we got together in about 2016 because we could tell, just as Irish women, we were all living in New York, that things were changing, things were happening. We'd been following the legal cases. My co-directors, Maeve O'Boyle and Lucy Kennedy, Maeve and I had talked about making a film on the subject a couple of years before that. And then we met Lucy. And it was actually, it's an unusual thing for three filmmakers to come together to co-direct and co-produce. But I suppose because we each brought our own lived experience and personal politics, and we really wanted this film to be very considered and very thoughtful and nuanced, we made a decision to work together on a very equal footing so that every decision we made would be carefully weighed and thought through. And we had all grown up in Ireland under the Eighth Amendment. And I suppose it personally affected me. I traveled for an abortion to London in my early 20s. And it was, you know, I was lucky. Most of my friends had been through it, had done it. We had a network. We could tap into it. And I also could access the funds. But I do remember, and it stayed with me for the 25 years since, waking up in the recovery room, and there was 3 other Irish women there. And we didn't really engage with each other. But I remember thinking, this is just wrong. We should all be waking up in our towns or the cities in our own country. So fast forward 20 years and later, and I get together with 2 amazing filmmakers, and we decided with the documentary, one thing you always have to think about is, why are we telling this story now, as well as what story we're telling. So we could tell something big was going to happen, and so this was the reason to tell this story now. So then, yes, it's a campaign, which is an amazing thing to have as a storyteller, because you have a natural inbuilt narrative arc. There's going to be an ending one way or the other. And it happened very quickly. So we really had to move quite fast. And one of the difficulties of not knowing how your story is going to turn out is very practically your resources. You have to be everywhere all the time. You don't know which story is going to be needed in the edit room to tell another story. So you're starting a lot of stories that you may not follow through on. So in a practical perspective, that's very challenging and it's demanding. And it means we started recording and capturing some people's work and their activism that we didn't end up using in the film, because you only have 84 minutes. And so you're constantly looking at, well, what do we need to tell the story, or what does the audience need to know here? It's a very short space of time. So while it was really invigorating, and there's a great energy to the campaign, on a practical level, creating a story from that, it does make it. Because the difference with this type of a film is that you're making it in the edit room. So your job in the moment is to get as much information, as much capture as you can. And then at the same time, being involved in a film like this that is unfolding in real time, I mean, obviously we were all invested hugely personally. And so that was also just another layer.
Ailbhe, I'd like to come back to you now and ask you, and this is it's a slightly generic question, but then I'd like you to focus in on your own relevant, grounded experience to answer it, which is, in terms of thinking about what you would extract from your experience for activists in other places, and of course, those of us here are eager to, hear about a success. What were some, I know, because I was there and because I've been connected, that Together for Yes was remarkable in its cohesion. What do you think, looking back, on some of the key different kinds of players that you needed to achieve that and to keep such a movement going?
That's really a very good question. And we do get asked that kind of question quite often. And I think, really a very important point, and something that I learned myself during the campaign quite early on, is that your campaign has to fit your context, your circumstances, the sorts of people, resources, the politics of the situation, and that people who come from elsewhere and tell you what kind of campaign to run, that doesn't work. You can listen, certainly, and hear what they're saying, but basically you have to tailor and customize and work your campaign for the people you're trying to persuade and convince and bring with you. And I think that is the most fundamental thing that any of us can do in a campaign, is to start off where we are and build from there, not from some kind of ideal place. So I think that, you know, the second point I would make, I think it was really important for us, and I mean, you know, layers and layers and layers of women and our allies to very self-consciously and deliberately say we're taking the initiative here, that this is not, we are not in a responding reactive situation. We are going to set the terms of the argument, the debate, and what we want. And I think that gives a great sense of confidence to people. It's not all that easy to do. I'm not saying it's easy, but it really helps if you can actually achieve that. And the third point I would make, again, I mean, the points I have alluded to earlier, is precisely seeking to achieve maximum cohesion. And that is a complete nightmare. I mean, I would never, ever go through that again. We, first of all, set up a group called the Coalition to Repeal the Eighth Amendment. Way back, actually, it started in 2012 and launched in 2013. So these things go back a very far way. And that was about bringing together the key organizations who, you know, that was the women's organization, like the National Women's Council, like the Abortion Rights Campaign. And in fact, our three organizations ultimately formed the Together for Yes campaign. Me and what I think of as my two compañeras, Orla O'Connor from the National Women's Council and Gráinne Griffin from the Abortion Rights Campaign. And we brought in more and more into the coalition, growing numbers of other organizations. We started with 12 and we grew to 100, 120, something like that. And that was very hard work. But what that meant was that, you know, you were and drawing in, because what you need to do, and this is why what Andrea did and what she's talking about is so important. You are not talking to the opposition. You are not trying to convince those people of something, because they're never going to change their minds. And you're not really all that much talking to your own people whose minds are also made up. You want to keep them, you know, energetic and energized and mobilized, but that's a rah-rah kind of thing. But strategically, you are speaking to the people who are there in the middle, so to speak. And they are very, very, very varied. And they're not incredibly interested in minutiae of the theological or medical arguments. You need to bring them along in a different way, and you need all kinds of people who can do that, who can speak with them. And the last point, I think I would say, I think it's really important. It was very important in our campaign. I think it's important in every campaign. We looked at the way people thought about abortion, and I'm talking about all those people who didn't really approve of abortion. And we thought about the kind of arguments that we would need to persuade them. And we said to ourselves, we have to reframe this whole issue of abortion, because the ways in which we have been reactively talking about it and defensively talking about it before haven't worked. So we need to do something much more constructive and much more positive, and present abortion as a need that women have for their well-being, for their good health. We need to present it not as a moral issue primarily, therefore, but as that necessity, that necessary health care. We need to present it certainly as a right that women are entitled to, but make it much more real and everyday. People don't, when you talk human rights, people don't actually see, they don't see people. They see, I don't know what, you know, something kind of vague up there. You have to get them to see people. So women coming forward and couples very bravely talking about their experiences of being denied abortion, or of the struggle they had in order to access abortion in Britain or elsewhere. That was really important, because that appealed, it gave people a real sense of what women were up against. And it also embedded emotion in the whole campaign, because you can have as many rational arguments as you like. Unless you get people in their hearts, you're not going to move them to somewhere they don't want to go. You absolutely have to do that. So you know, when I think about whether it's Poland or Poland, where the women are fighting such an incredible battle, or when I think about the US with its entirely different kind of politics and context, there is no template that can be laid on that. The one thing I think I would say is that cohesion is absolutely crucial. Unless you get people to work together to achieve that really difficult aim, it's just never going to happen. It's always going to be hard, and you always have to be patient. But that cohesiveness, that sense of we're all marching in the same direction, whether it's with our feet on the ground, whether it's canvassing, whether it's throwing glitter, whether it's doctors for choice speaking as experts, whether it's lawyers, you know, whatever it is, you all have to be connected. And I think that's a huge challenge for the US, which is such a huge, enormous, and sadly at the moment still very divided country. So it is a big challenge. I don't have an answer, but I hope that, you know, I always hope that what we did, it's not a template, it's not a model, but I hope that it gives people some sense of possibility and hope. Well, if they can do it in that little small, supposedly very Catholic country, surely we can do it as well. It's more that kind of attitude, I think.
Well, I am extracting something that I wouldn't call a template, but I would call some high level approach. And that is, firstly, the kind of way you thought about it, which since I teach advocacy, that's what we say, figure out your objective, figure out what you need to get there, who you need to play with, etc. So that kind of straightforward organizing of approach. But then I think the other two things you've been saying that I think I just want to remind the audience about for when we all get to talk is being affirmative and not defensive, because certainly in the United States, those of us working around issues of abortion and reproductive rights have been defensive for so long. And also the question of cohesion, because that you said, and many people say, you're not talking to your opposition, you're not talking to your compañeras, you're talking to the middle. But in fact, the people on your own side can give you a hard time too, because they don't like the compromises you make in order to achieve the cohesion. So I just, again, want to flag that for the audience to think about and for us perhaps to have time to discuss. So Leah, have you found the Irish experience useful elsewhere in your efforts to use this human rights and legal approach at the service of other activists? Have you found people looking to Ireland or learning something from Ireland?
Yeah, so I think, our work is really with human rights defenders and with advocates and civil society organizations in their own countries to bring whatever we can and whatever support we can provide. Sometimes that's working on the kind of cases we worked on in Ireland with those women, but sometimes it's other engagement. It's providing information, it's strategizing together, it's making links across countries so that folks can feel the connections, learn from each other, and have that sense of solidarity. So our work, I feel like, is very guided by the needs of local civil society organizations and women rights defenders, basically. And, we work in human rights, and human rights is a key framework for the Centre for Reproductive Rights and for all of us, I would say. But in the Irish context, that was not the focus of the campaign. And other things like healthcare evidence and information was very key. Individual stories were very key. And basically, it's our job to adapt to those contexts and work to provide the support that is needed, if any support is needed, for the local actors who are really the ones on the front lines leading the way. And I think what I would say is, so it's not about whether I think there are lessons learned from Ireland. I might, as an Irish person and as, you know, someone active in this movement, generally, I might do that. But what I'm really interested in is, do other civil society movements and activists and human rights defenders in other countries feel there is learning? And they do, and they are asking for this.
Okay.
And it's not because they think there's a template in any sense of the word. Everyone, I think, who's on the ground fighting these fights knows that their context, they have to design their strategy organically to their own context. But what I think they're interested in is picking out the pieces of what some of the strategies and some of the initiatives in Ireland and learning from them, because they see them as maybe particularly relevant for their own context. So I think, you know, we're working in Europe with women and organizations in Poland, in Slovakia, in Germany, in Armenia, just as a, you know, few examples to give you. And they are all looking to and hoping to have conversations and learn from the organizations and the individuals who did what they did in Ireland. I think particular interest in different countries in different aspects. So there's a lot of interest also because it's not necessarily been common to our movement or to human rights movements or social change movements in general to use public attitudes research and to really design messaging that's influenced from public attitudes research, and to build a campaign that really speaks to the people. That's not something that's maybe been, that's a familiar strategy for activists in social change movements in many contexts. And that's something that they're very interested in learning from the Irish experience, and learning from kind of the experts who did that work with Ailbhe and others in Ireland. The other thing that's been very key for them is that the role of medical professionals and the fact that while Doctors for Choice were active for many years when it wasn't easy, mainstream medical professionals and the health sector and professional bodies representing the medical profession in Ireland were not active and were silent for decades. And then something began to change, and it became more possible for them to play a very visible role and to be spokespeople as to why change was needed. And so there's a lot of interest in other countries where they may grapple with the same problems with their own medical profession, for example, in Poland, in learning and kind of what did Irish organizations and activists do to enable and to support medical professionals to come out and to be the spokespeople that they needed to be. That's another area where there's interest. And I think also an interest in the role of which, as Ailbhe said, individual stories play. And I think for us, that's also the case with those cases that we took. I mean, what were they at their heart? Yes, they were cases to a UN body, but at their heart, they are the stories of two individuals and all of what they endured because of the ban on abortion. And I think kind of understanding the ways in which people can make their own situations part of a movement for change is something that other organizations are really interested in learning from. So it can be filing a case or can be through media work, but there were also other ways in which the different activists and organizations in Ireland made it possible for women to tell their stories and to contribute, to share their own experiences and their voices to become part of that movement. So that's also something I think that is very resonant for people doing this work in other contexts.
So that gives me a perfect segue to Andrea, because she has told us about the utility of applying all sorts of different approaches, social media, glitter, etc., to get people involved. Can you say something? Let me just say one thing. My internet I'm getting messages that it's problematic. So if I get completely funky, Emily, will you just take over for me?
Yes, no problem.
But in any event, what I wanted to, the end of the thought, Andrea, was what in your experience, might you suggest that people working elsewhere consider about getting people involved who don't consider themselves to be activists, you know, who that for whom that's not their self-definition?
I think the main thing is to realize and see if you're not represented as a niche, that there's other people like you who also aren't represented, and that if you have whatever skills you have that you can contribute, that they're all worthy and valid. And that was very important, I suppose, when we came to talk to Ailbhe initially, because we were going in with this like bizarre little campaign, the Unreal Issues, and when we approached her, I was like, what do you think? And she's like, yeah, that's, go for it, come to the meetings. That support, and that validated what we were doing. Whereas if I could have had like, well, this isn't really relevant, or this, I don't know if this is the way you campaign, or is this how advocacy works? So I kind of had to take those questions away and say, okay, I've got these skills, I know how to target audiences, I know how to communicate a message, and I know how to bring people on a journey. So that is all a valid thing to do. So I also knew that I wasn't being spoken to in the way campaigning had been done in the past, and it wasn't like, obviously it communicated with me because I got involved, but I knew that it wasn't hitting my sweet spot of how I wanted to communicate. So I knew there was more people like that, and that was validated by the girls talking to me in the salon and people coming into the salon, and that it wasn't hitting them as well. So I think if you can't see the age elder, if you can't see yourself being targeted, and if it's not hitting your niche, well, then make your own niche and bring your learnings and your skills to the fore.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. And Aideen, in terms of this question I'm raising for everybody about how the Irish experience might be useful elsewhere, you've been going around with the film. So what have you experienced about, you know, the use of the film, but the use of the Irish experience in a broader sense elsewhere? How are people relating to it or understanding it?
Thanks, Wendy. I mean, we've had a great, adventure with the film over the last year, and Andrea and Ailbhe, and many conversations have been had. I think we're not activists, we are filmmakers, but I suppose we made this film very specifically to be used by activists and by campaigners. And that was one of our goals, that the film would tell a really good story, that then would be one part of a conversation in social change and movement building. So that's been what we've concentrated on a lot, is making sure the film is available to people to work in other ways. I mean, one of the responses we've gotten a lot is like, well, it's a good film, it's a happy ending, you know, you win. And so just even with the fatigue of campaigners and activists, you know, it can just give you a lift and give you hope. And this did happen in Ireland with the history that we come from. So we're planning at the moment, I think it's a 20-city tour in Poland. So I'm really looking forward to that, and looking forward to the conversations. And plans are in place for other things like that. So, you know, we you know, it's not so much what lessons can be learned from the film, but it's using the film in your own campaigns and in your own activist work. And hopefully it, you know, can spark conversations, it can engage people. And very much like, and what Andrea was saying, it's to break out of the maybe the normal places our film might be very welcomed and everyone will listen to it. It's to get it outside of that as well and use it for change. And one other thing, just to...
I'm going to start reading some of the questions. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that I do think it's really important, something I learned by documenting the campaign.
Did I cut you off? I apologize.
That's okay. Is about centering the communities that are directly affected by these issues. They have to be at the heart of any strategy around a campaign.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's...
So one of the things that I've learned from my involvement in Ireland, and this is not something that we've spent time talking about and won't today, but I do want to flag it for everybody's attention. You've talked about the perseverance needed for a campaign, and the perseverance needed for the compromises in the campaign, and the long, you know, dedication and multiple approaches, etc. And in this case, the glory of victory. But what I've really been struck by, because of my involvement, my specific involvement there, is the need for advocacy after victory. Because Ireland did this wonderful, amazing thing. It repealed the 8th. But then you had to have a service in place. Nobody knew anything about it. I mean, the doctors had not been trained. The Department of Health hadn't set up a service. The women who wanted the service had no experience of getting one in the country. So I'm just flagging for people that there's victory and then there's getting to work and making it all happen. But let me turn to some of the questions that have been coming in. And again, Emily, if my internet quits on me, you run with it. One of the questions was about, this has to do with the timing of all the things that Ailbhe in particular laid out for us about what was going on 10 years ago and 8 years ago. And around those times, I'm not going to have the years exactly right, there were also some major revelations about the abuses of the organization of the Catholic Church in Ireland. There were the revelations about the pedophilic priests, and there were all sorts of revelations which continue to this day about the Magdalene laundries and the other places where wayward girls were sent, and not only the horrible treatment of these young women, but all these discoveries of mounds of baby bones. So given that Ireland is a predominantly Catholic country and has had a very conservative Catholic regime for a long time, did those revelations play a role? How did that contribute, or did it not?
I would say that those revelations, which really started to be surfaced, to be unearthed, really at the beginning of the 1990s, were making their way through Irish society over a period of time. So, Ireland was gradually and also actually becoming a more, unfortunately, neoliberal economy during the 90s, also made us a more secular place and also a more prosperous place. And Ireland was changing very, very rapidly. So that was a whole process. But there is absolutely no doubt that the very brutal abuse by the Catholic Church as an institution of women and their babies, that is to say, those women who, for all kinds of reasons, not necessarily waywardness, Wendy, but who ended up in those institutions one way and another, that brutal treatment that was meted out to those women was a source of, seething anger among women in the country, and gradually extended to include men. So, that was growing and growing and growing. And in fact, it has kind of reached what I hope may be an acme recently with a big report on what happened to women in what were known as the mother and baby homes. So that was a factor. But what was really very interesting in both the marriage equality referendum, which was in 2015, and which we also won by a big majority of 62%, and then abortion in 2018, which we won by 66.4%, it was very, very clear that there was this general shift on the part of the people who are sovereign in a referendum, to having a much more open view, to being much less judgmental, to being much less willing to accept any diktat of the Catholic Church. But what was fascinating to me was that the Catholic Church did not play a significant role openly or explicitly in either of those two referendum campaigns. And I think that once they lost the marriage equality, once they realized that marriage equality was going to go through, they sort of saved up all of their energy for the abortion referendum, and then realized that to try to teach the Irish people some kind of lesson about the meaning of Catholicism at that point was completely redundant, that would backfire on them, because, you know, Irish people were not going to take lessons from anybody in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, given the absolute, you know, slew of scandals right across the board that had occurred for years and years and years. So they strategically kept their mouths closed, with the result that the opposition kept saying, this is not a religious issue. This has nothing to do with religion. And you'd be looking at them and you'd be thinking, actually it does, but maybe we won't go there either, because we didn't need to. We didn't need to go there. So, you know, you have that sense that that long pent up anger, which was on a kind of slow release over nearly 2 decades, was really driving that change of opinion and the opening up of Irish people to, or people in Ireland just generally, to thinking about these issues. That was there, but we didn't in a way have to explicitly address or reference that. That was just simply there, and it was there, I suppose, from the get-go. So it was a really interesting experience. People have some view of us beating back Catholics. Not at all. I mean, the 66.4% of people who voted in the referendum, probably something like 55 or 50 or 55% of them considered themselves to be, you know, fine, upstanding Catholics. But their minds had been changed. They decided that they now decided what was right and what was not the Catholic Church, who, as I say, could give lessons to no one. And the Catholic Church has recognised that in Ireland and is now setting up some consultative process to last for several years as to how it can refresh itself, which I think will be very, very interesting. So it's been very, very fascinating.
I'd just love to jump in there, Wendy, to
Please.
throw this to Andrea as well, because what we found was that the Catholic Church did not factor into anything of the thinking of the women that she was engaged with. So this was a whole new Ireland, you know, for us to experience. I wonder if Andrea will talk about that a little.
You're still on mute.
Right. Yeah, I think religion isn't that much of a factor for so many people in Ireland now, or my age and younger, and that their spirituality has changed in terms of the way we're engaging with churches, and it's like the rise of yoga and spirituality is really informing people a lot more, and that is all about fairness and equality and respect. And I think the Catholic Church has definitely lost its power in that sense, for sure. So yeah, I think that's...
So that is remarkably different than our experience here. And I can tell you, as a former provider of abortions, and certainly somebody who's worked alongside providers for many years, we are all familiar with having a religious opponent of abortion bring her daughter in for a procedure, but then go right out to the picket line against the clinic. There's this quality of, mine is okay because I have exceptional circumstances, but not extending that vision to anyone else. We are just about out of time, and there are many questions left, and I just am going to throw 2 of them out and ask if anybody wants to dive in. Please do, but also do so remarkably briefly, like, you know, quick. The 2 are, is there anything about the efforts to reframe, and here I think that's particularly Andrea and Ailbhe, anything about the efforts to reframe that were particularly successful? And then this is a question for everybody, which is there, thinking back, is there anything you wish, not just you personally, but you wish had been done differently?
Andrea, go.
I think in terms of what stood out for us in our campaign was we worked with an artist called Mazer, who designed, we initially had asked him to design something to put on his social media. He's a male artist, a lot of male followers. And it was when we were discussing what it was going to be, it was like we wanted to have something that was really positive, that was really uplifting, that would engage you, and be right in your face of what it was about, but also that it was positive and uplifting. So he created this heart mural that we then used in different places around the country. And it first went up in Temple Bar in the Project Art Centre at the theatre, and it was right in the centre of town. And the whole point of it was that you would be walking through town and you would have to face that this was an issue that was happening, that was something that you can't hide from, but that didn't have to be scary. And I think in terms of reframing, that really was very strong for us. And then it was we had to take it down because we had complaints and all whatever that happened around that. But then what happened that mobilized loads of people to make their own. So we released the artwork without rights, and people made it their own. They were making donuts out of it. They were projecting it onto opera theaters. They were putting it up in their windows. They made stickers, and people made it their own. And again, it was all about empowering people to make things their own and not try and control the narrative and not try to have it your way, that it was up to you to bring people on the journey, but then release out what you had, that they would take it upon themselves to make their own.
Well, that's an interesting possible tension with the cohesion of Together for Yes, because the people who were involved in Together for Yes, as far as my understanding, and you will correct me if I am, my outsider vision is wrong, that it was stay on message, care, compassion, and whatever the third thing was. And that's the point that we had, mentioned earlier about compromise and sometimes your own folks being irritated with you. So anyhow, I'm just flagging this as attention because you're getting people involved by, making it their own. And then the campaign has got a real discipline. And so that's interesting to me. Ailbhe, any thoughts, or anybody?
Yeah, no, that was, well, certainly the installation of the heart at the heart of the campaign, in a way, was, I think, incredibly important. And there was always flexibility. It was in the campaign in terms of what Together for Yes was doing officially. We were, yes, absolutely strict with our messaging, but that was also, very possible. It was care, compassion, as you say. But then we had the two silent C's of change and also choice. I mean, that notion of choice, which generally we spoke about as being a decision at the time, that was very much at the heart of it. But I was going to say, in relation to what Andrea said, that whole sense of this being, of evoking an empathetic response in people, which was, I think, illustrated so well in the whole Mazer mural. That was absolutely key to the campaign. And of course, it was carried through by the incredibly brave testimonies that women and couples gave. And we understood that very well in the campaign. So, yes, I mean, there were things that people didn't like, the fact that we didn't actually use the word choice very often. But as we came towards the end of the campaign, you would be canvassing people and you would say, well, we think it's very important that women should be able to make decisions about their own reproductive lives, etc., etc. And somebody would look at you and they'd say, like, you mean like be able to make a choice? You'd say, yes, actually, yes, we do mean choice. And that was a very good proof that we brought the people to that point. We didn't tell them to think it. They thought it for themselves. And as to what I would do differently, I think I wouldn't worry quite as much as I did. On the other hand, we all say that, and without the worry, where do you get without the worry? So the worry, I see Leah is nodding as well. The worry goes with the territory, Leah, doesn't it?
Can I jump back in on the tension thing as well?
Please.
I think when you have a campaign who's leading the way and bringing the messages and the strategy, and that's filtering down, then you can let the work be done by other groups who don't have to make the compromises, and they can do their own thing and bring the stuff that you want to be able to do in the campaign, but you can't because you've got a strategy in place. But that can be then filtered out to the smaller groups who are doing their little bits in support of that. And I think that's a really important thing about the whole cohesion.
That's very helpful.
All the different groups.
We are, of course, several minutes over time. So I'm just going to end by, and we're not going to have time to discuss this, but I just want to throw this out to the American audience as to whether or not we too are at a possible moment of inflection. We did just have a very significant election. We are embarked on all sorts, our new government is embarked on all sorts of changes that could be viewed as really seizing the affirmative. And so is this a moment for us to also think about being very affirmative? And with that, over to you, Emily. And thank you, everybody, immensely.
Yes, thank you, everyone, so much. I don't know, I know that it's getting to be late, especially we've got people from Geneva and Ireland on this call, as well as around the world. I saw a question from someone working in Zimbabwe.
Oh.
So I'd just like to really thank our audience for joining and thank all of you as panelists. Leah, in particular, I know you had to leave and wasn't sure if you wanted to share a final thought before doing so. And Aideen, if there's something you wanted to jump in and contribute for your final thought on what you might have done differently with this artistic work, please feel free to.
You know, a filmmaker, you're never going to look at your film and think, oh yeah, that's perfect. You'd always do things differently. But I'm not going to tell you what they are. So I don't want to take from your viewing. But bottom line, more time, more money, more resources. That's what you always want on a film. And then just as a final thought, I mean, if people want to engage with us on the film and use it for screenings or in their work, just get in touch with us. We have a website, the8thfilm.com, or follow us on social media. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, that's a great ending. I hope this conversation brings a lot more people into the fore, willing to kind of engage with each other across these really interesting ideas around activism and what that means, which is really what the point of this whole series was when Jessica and I started brainstorming a year ago. So again, this is really the perfect culminating event. And thank you all so much for your amazing work, for the incredible progress you've made in what was a long period of time, but what also feels like an incredibly amazing turnaround and victory in not that long period of time, for those of us on the outside, perhaps. And again, thank you all for your time. We will be posting this recording to our YouTube pages. Again, for anyone who's willing to share that, please do. And everyone have a wonderful Friday evening and weekend.